AI systems currently, so that we can dive into a more detailed discussion of how we can sort of address those gaps and what current initiatives to address the gaps look like. So just a little bit of background first. The Center for Democracy and Technology is a over 30-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. and Brussels. We've conducted a lot of landmark studies into examining multilingual LLMs and then also interrogating their use in content moderation settings, specifically as they relate to content moderation in low resource languages widely and commonly spoken in the global south. In our paper, Lost in Translation, we looked at key architectural, training, and testing gaps that exist that could then sort of impede the ability for large language models to work in different language contexts apart from English. And we found sort of key gaps in those three sort of buckets. In the training data sense, I think it's widely understood that that large language models are commonly trained on data that is sort of scraped off the web or widely accessibly, easily found on the web through Common Crawl, through widely sourced data sets made available through Common Crawl or other sort of open repositories. And those data sets often over-index on and over-represent the English language. So what we found in our study that was published in 2023 is that the vast majority of these multilingual systems were still trained on over 60% of English language data. So I think everyone in the room kind of understands that the sort of little 40% of data that it does represent non-English languages is often not fully representative of the plurality of ways we speak those languages. And AI companies sort of asserted quite confidently that these systems nonetheless worked in these languages, even when, especially in low resource languages, they were trained on one or maybe no data in that language. And the few data sets that did exist to train these systems were either machine translated, which means that they were replete with errors, or were just poor substitutes of how we spoke. Another gap we found was that there was an over-reliance on model architectures that sort of privileged English or Anglo-centric or Western sort of capabilities. And so there was an over-reliance on the belief that large language models were going to be the sort of solution in multilingual capabilities, when researchers, including the ones on the panel and others, have found that often smaller architecture, smaller language models are more effective in these low resource languages, those languages with very few data sets. There was also a belief in the possibility of employing cross-lingual transfer models or methods to teach models how to perform in these low resource languages by using examples found in high resource languages. So for example, a model would learn, sentence structure in English and then translate that or apply that, transpose that onto low resource settings. Although anyone who speaks languages from the global majority or any language apart from English knows that English is sort of unique language, unique Creole of languages where the sort of subject, verb, object syntax doesn't easily apply or map onto our languages that we speak. And finally, I'm going pretty quickly because I want to get into the panel. Finally, there was a lot of gaps in the sort of testing regimes that major model developers employed in that, they made claims that these systems worked in non-English languages, but in fact, those claims were not rigorously tested, were not tested using evaluations created by those very communities that speak the languages that they were being tested in. And often they were employing very large automated benchmarks that were machine translated into multiple languages, and then testing using those benchmarks that were not perfect proxies for the context they were being used in. And then the reporting, the score that was reported for multilingual capabilities sort of was just one number that was said, it works. It works 98% of the time on this X amount of languages. There wasn't a lot of disaggregation of data. There wasn't a lot of sort of parsing of what the prompts were, whether those prompts were sort of contextually aligned. And so, these three buckets sort of offer a lot more, offer more questions than answers about how to advance multilingual capabilities. So today we have a panel of experts that work either in the technical side, the policy side, the academic research side, or really interrogating the societal socio-technical analysis of multilingual models in action, and are trying to understand, how can we advance these systems, advance capabilities, but do so in a way that actually represents communities and represents the community's desires for where AI can be beneficial to them. I'll briefly introduce our panelists. So first, to my left, we have Arushi Gupta, Senior Research Manager at Digital Futures Lab, deftly stepping in for Urvashi Aneja. She's done a lot of work on benchmarking, gender-related benchmarking in Indian languages, and so we're happy to hear her insights. Next to her, we have Dhanaraj Thakur. He is the director of the Emerging Technology Initiative at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and is looking at concepts of AI, democracy, and race. And also was a previous collaborator on a lot of this research related to content moderation in the Global South. Next to him is Tajuddin Gwadabe. He is the programs and MEL lead at the Masakhane African Languages Hub. I've already had the privilege of hearing him at another AI Summit event, and so really interested to hear more about some of the benchmarking and African language representation work you're working on. And then finally, but absolutely not the least, we have Chinasa Tiakolo, policy expert, founder, Technicultura, consultant with the UN, and just all-around analyst and expert related to African governance regimes, global governance regimes, and institutional mechanisms of AI governance. So very happy to have you. Thank you so much. I'm going to kick us off with a question that sort of hopefully builds on the very cursory opening remarks I just gave with Tajuddin. Masakhane is one of the leading sort of both research consortia in representative data sets and representative ML, but is also working as a sort of grant maker to foster an ecosystem, foster a virtuous cycle of research into African language representation in NLP, in AI broadly. And you've started a lot of this work through the proper Masakhane, but also now through the African Languages Hub. So I sort of gave a little bit of stage setting on some of the gaps, some of the concerns. What, according to you, is one of the biggest gap you're working on when it comes to multilingual AI capabilities, and how are you doing so?
Am I audible? Okay, thank you. So how many minutes do I have for this?
We have 35 minutes, so just go on.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think when it comes to African languages, there are lots of challenges. And start thinking about that a lot of the work that has been done earlier in terms of NLP is translation from English or French to an African language. Meaning that when currently, if you want to translate from an African language to an African language, mostly it means that you have to go through either French or English. So we don't even have that level of capability, even in terms of the data that would enable translation or other forms of NLP tasks directly within African languages, which is one of the biggest gaps, apart from the fact that we don't have sufficient data for training models. Now, some of that work has been done in terms of trying to see, at least for machine translation, getting data sets that are parallel not just to English, but within other African languages. It's really a very difficult task because you have to now think about alignment, and mostly you go to issues of lack of some words might not exist in other languages, or kind of how they translate is different, and it becomes a lot of more challenging activity in terms of doing that. So that's one aspect. The other one is for existing LLMs, a lot of them might be good in some African languages, like the ones that we have been building for, like Swahili, Hausa, Yoruba. However, when it comes to a culturally relevant question, it usually fails. Now, a culturally relevant question might be a simple thing as suggestion for breakfast, which in my tradition, this is like something common. There is the common food that is been eaten, but then in the morning, but when you go to another tradition, it's quite different. So most of the models then fail at that point, because if you are not intentionally trained for that, most of the way, as you've mentioned, the data it's been sourced is from the internet, and because our languages are not represented on the internet, meaning that they cannot go into those models, meaning that even if the designers or the builders of the models are intentional through the methods that they're doing in terms of scraping the websites, and they still cannot get to models that can support culturally relevant context for most of African languages. Now, what we've been doing, or what the Hub is currently interested in, it's this capability of building data sets that are multilingual and centered on cultural context. So we do have our, like you mentioned, the grant making part of what we're doing. We are looking at grants to develop multilingual, multimodal data sets for about 40 African languages, and multimodal in the sense that it would have a text component, it would have a voice component, and it would have an image component. So starting from, say, an image of a painting, I'm just looking at a painting over there. So if this is like a painting from an African culture, and then an explainer of what the painting is all about, then vocalizing that, it means that with such a data set, we could go to develop models that can actually look at a picture in an African context, and then if someone should ask a question using their voice, they can get an answer, and then that would enable models, and then that would enable communities to actually use models in that multilingual sense, because they are now culturally centered. One of the things we are also looking at through that process is to enable that African language to African language translation. So because some cultures have some languages are from similar cultures, so you can use some images, and then you can have the same the text content and the voice content that are similar. Eventually, we know that a lot of African languages do not necessarily have writing systems, and looking at a technology that can enable voice-to-voice communication, I think helps. Just to add one more thing before I end. So I'm just going to give a very typical example. Nigeria has over 200 million population. We have 3 main languages. I speak one of the languages, but I don't speak the other 2. So language is usually something that has caused issues in the Nigerian context, and enabling multilingualism and that potentiality of understanding each other in an easier way will eliminate some of those tension. And I think it has that possibility of solving some of the potential crises that are happening because of miscommunication between tribes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you teed me off well for a question I have for Arushi. But before I start, I think I just want to note that it's very intentional for us to start off with, I think, the work you're doing, and also, I think, the African context, because I think the summit will succeed if we are doing a lot of like South-on-South collaboration, because a lot of multilingual researchers working in advancing these capabilities are actually facing the same things, maybe in different contexts with maybe different sort of factors, but I think there is a lot to sort of learn between the African context, the Indian context, obviously the Southeast Asian context, Latin American, etc. And so, Arushi, you've done a lot of work on benchmarking of models, but also like sort of questioning how we measure success, how we measure effective capabilities not only in Indian languages, but when it comes to things like gender or caste or things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that work and maybe comment on the broader notion that it's not just language, it's also context?
Great. Thanks, Alia, for that question. I mean, over the last couple of days, I've been hearing a lot about AI localization. So it's glad that you're holding space to really dig into the question of what localization really means, especially in large language models. One of the pieces that we've really been emphasizing is in terms of disaggregating the localization piece and the cultural contextualizing piece, right? Language is one part of it, right? It is one dimension of culture, but there are many other things that culture encapsulates. It could be local histories, it could be endemic power asymmetries, it could be food, cuisine, it could be variety of everyday practices that structure the social life around us, right? And not always do local language data sets, especially those that currently find their way into AI training data sets via internet data, encapsulate those accurately, right? So just to give you an example, when within the Indian context, there are several foundation general purpose models coming up. And one of the models uses soap opera scripts as the data source, right? Whose culture does that really represent? And that's, of course, a big question for all of us to unpack together. Coming to the second aspect that we emphasize is culture is, of course, not homogeneous, right? And I know it's, of course, a very run-of-the-mill argument, but I think it's worth emphasizing every time I can, is especially in the Indian context and many other global south countries, you have multiple ethnicities, religions, you have multiple lived experiences, right? Specifically, even when it comes to gender, when it comes to caste, when it comes to race, when it comes to class, and several intersecting elements therein. How do we ensure that a model captures those nuances, right? The other bit related to that is also when a lot of models depend on internet data, they are already privileging a very select strata of society, right? A lot of Indians, a lot of people in the global majority are not on the internet. Their culture is not represented on Facebook, on Instagram, right? It still lies as part of oral histories, as part of analog worlds that simply don't find their way into the AI arena yet. Coming specifically to the gender point, I think rather than anything abstract, I just want to share one example that has really stayed with me. Is we were working with an organization that was building a sexual reproductive healthcare chatbot for women from marginalized communities within India. And they had training data sets that they had sourced from government websites, but they'd also simultaneously done household surveys asking women, how do you prompt a chatbot when you have a query on SRH, specifically in English, in Marathi? After a lot of iterations during their user testing, they realized that their model can't tell the difference between abortion and miscarriage because the Hindi word for both those terms is the same. So every time the woman would report a miscarriage, it would assume they have gone through an abortion. So what they did is that they did focus group discussions. And they genuinely asked the women, then how do you in your language differentiate the two? They picked on those sort of aspects and fed them back into the training data, right? So that was the iterative, community-centered example that I wanted to give because a lot of those buzzwords have come up over the last few days. So I hope that helps sort of illustrate that conversation a bit. But yeah, let me pause here.
Thanks so much. I think that example really sort of is tangible about like what we risk doing. I mean, there's a lot written about the sort of macro flattening of language, which is, I think, a very important point as well, but more tangibly at the individual level also, how are you impeding people's ability to, assuming a type of user and then impeding users from accessing really almost life-saving information in a lot of contexts, especially at the scale of AI adoption. And just before I hop into the next question, one thing I learned while doing this research, in the last few years, was the acronym WEIRD NLP, which WEIRD standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Dominant Developed Countries. And WEIRD NLP is a nice an entire subfield of study that sort of looks into what you were just talking about, the over-indexing of certain perspectives in data sets, in current AI model capabilities, and who does it not privilege. So Dhanaraj, I wanted to hop over to you to ask this question. A lot of your work has thought about representation and inclusion, both through other trust and safety related research and platform governance, and then also most recently in examining how automated systems and human processes in sort of large tech companies often, how they work in a set of languages known as Quechua, and then how they also assume sort of sideline indigenous languages. And I just wanted to give you the floor to talk a little bit about this research, but also what's at stake when major regimes don't fail to take into consideration these communities' perspectives and communities' sort of lived realities and identity.
Great. All right, thank you, Alia. And thanks to the organizers for allowing us to have the space and this session to discuss these issues. So I think this is an important question around representation and inclusion, something I think all of us on the panel think about and many in the audience as well. I think, representation, inclusion around the design, development, deployment of models. What I would like to do is just step back a bit and consider, from a systems level point of view, the socio-technical system, how representation and inclusion plays out within those systems and what that then implies for the deployment of AI tools, LLMs, and so on within those systems. And to be more clear, what I'm talking about here is, and this is based on research Alia alluded to, that she, myself, and another colleague, Mona Elsua, led, looked at content moderation systems across the majority world. And so the example I'll use is a case of Quechua. And by content moderation systems, I mean not only just the classifiers and the various kinds of LLM tools that, say, social media companies may use to assess user-generated content, but also the human systems and processes that surround the use of those tools. And so, to give an example, when we talk about representation and inclusion, one of the first things to note is that content moderation policies, in the case of Quechua, when we explore this in detail, start with policies that are developed in English and Spanish. So starting with this kind of high-level or high-resource languages, already there's an indication of exclusion at that point, right? And then based on interviews with Quechua content moderators, so people that who spoke Quechua but worked among firms that were contracted by social media to assess user-generated content, what they told us was that user content in Quechua was initially machine translated into Spanish for review. And then based on those translations, it may or may not be flagged for further assessment, then often by a human moderator, i.e. the Quechua-speaking content moderators. That in itself could be a whole separate discussion, but I just want to highlight the process here and the system in which these tools are being used. And then on the user side, through a series of surveys and interviews with Quechua-speaking social media users, we found that the kinds of classifiers or tools used by these social media companies often failed in assessing particularly harmful content that was generated in Quechua. So the users would often tell us how this kind of content was simply left online because these companies or the tools they're using could not parse it, could not understand it. And this was relative to Spanish, where Spanish content, harmful content, was often flagged and addressed appropriately by these companies. All of this points to ways in which these poorly applied machine learning tools within these systems fail speakers of certain languages, particularly low resource and indigenous language. And it points to how the system as a whole, from the start, involves some degree of exclusion, involves some degree of a lack of representation of speakers of certain languages, i.e. the content moderation policies. And so then that just filters down into the way the LLMs or classifiers are then applied, because they similarly involve, as we have heard from previous speakers, various kinds of limitations in the way they might be useful for indigenous and low resource languages. In fact, when we pointed out these kinds of problems to NLP researchers and LLM developers who work in Quechua, they were particularly surprised that these companies were using these kinds of tools in this way and found it highly problematic. And when we spoke to Quechua linguistic activists and advocates, they themselves reported that they were not aware of any opportunities to provide some kind of feedback to these companies to help them improve these systems as well as tools, nor were they aware of any kind of consultation with their communities in the first place to help develop these systems or tools. What I'll conclude is that I think in general, this kind of problem stems from a motivation, particularly from large global companies that are obsessed with scale and obsessed with providing one kind of tool, one tool to rule them all, so this, as it were, one kind of all general purpose tool to address and to be useful for the huge diverse set of communities and languages that we have around the world. I think I'll pause there for now and come back.
Thank you. And I think you've sort of teed us up into a nice sort of next round. Let's try to leave some time at the end for questions from the audience, but a next round to talk about, what can we do about it? And I think to kick us off, let's go to Chinasa, who's thinking a lot about and has studied, written extensively about institutional mechanisms to either improve the state of multilingual LLMs or evaluate how current institutional mechanisms are working in the AI governance space. So can you talk us through a little bit of what global AI governance regimes are looking at, either through voluntary commitments, soft law instruments, or actually hard law instruments when it comes to multilingual systems or just general AI governance in those contexts?
I'll focus my comments mostly on the African context because that's where I do a lot of my research. But my work at the United Nations, I focus more broadly on international AI cooperation. And so when it comes to Africa specifically, there are about 20 countries or so that have these national AI strategies. A lot of them focused on one, AI sovereignty and also becoming a leader in AI somehow. There doesn't seem to be a lot of specific mandates for multilingual AI models, but I think that kind of falls under making AI more inclusive, which is a common word or phrase throughout a lot of these AI strategies and some policy frameworks. And so there have been some governments actually on the continent that have made efforts towards developing multilingual AI models of their own. Particularly the Nigerian government actually developed in partnership with a local AI company a national LLM called InAtlas. And so it serves 4 languages, Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa, along with Nigerian Pidgin. And so the goal is to expand it. I'm not sure what the timeline for that is, but we've seen other efforts from global majority countries like LATAM GPT that was led by Chile's National AI Center, and then also efforts from Southeast Asia with Sea Lion, their model for Southeast Asian languages. And so we'll continue to see a lot of these nationalized efforts come to play, and a lot of this is due to more so, let's say, big tech not serving these languages even at all, and if they do, it's not necessarily as accurate as if they would be if they had taken the time to invest properly in the data infrastructures and also the social infrastructures that are needed to support, effective and comprehensive LLM development. And so when it comes to other regions more broadly, on forthcoming AI legislation or regulation, I think again, like sovereignty is the key part. Because of one, reducing this reliance on big tech, and then also, again, trying to understand or ensure that local ecosystems have a chance to thrive, and with that, contribute to AI and data solutions as well.
Thanks so much, Chinasa. And I think, a parallel trend we're seeing right now with a lot of government investment in sovereign AI, however they want to sort of define that, are community-led initiatives. I think we're seeing a lot of partnerships with either industry and also community-facing civil society organizations to create community-led either benchmarks or data sets to develop systems that maybe represent the views of people who may not be represented in the majoritarian perspectives that are often over-indexed on in government data sets, government initiatives. And so this is really a question to the entire panel. What are some promising initiatives in the field of multilingual or unilingual in non-English languages to advance AI capabilities or specific automated solutions for very specific needs that come to mind to you that you want to spotlight?
Again. And so I'll talk about an effort from a research lab at the University of Pretoria. This is a data science law lab, and they actually, in partnership with CPIT, it's a technology center at Strathmore University in Kenya, and the professors Melissa Amino and also Chijoke Okori have focused on developing this framework called Nulite Obodo. And the goal of that is to set basically a data governance framework for ensuring that communities and people are compensated for the data that they provide to large language models and data sets that are used by AI companies to train these models. And so I think this is a really important part of governance, one, because it comes from academic research, it's rooted in the needs of communities, and even though it's not, let's say, legally enforceable, it does provide alternate mechanisms for governance and also ensuring that there's fair compensation and also just generally fairness and justice in this AI ecosystem, because we have seen big tech companies leech off the work of these grassroots AI organizations like Masakane, Ghana NLP, and many others across the African continent to train their models. And they're just now, not just now, but you'd say over the past couple years, starting to ramp up their interest and finally focusing on African languages and others, across South and Southeast Asia, to integrate them into tools like Google Translate, Siri, etc. I mean, Apple honestly is not doing a good job with Siri, but that's another thing. And so it's really important that communities work in conversation with civil society and also academia to develop these new mechanisms to ensure self-governance. In many cases where, let's say Africa, where there isn't a formal AI law yet. And so this can really help solve or address some of these issues that we're starting to see pop up in the ecosystem.
Okay, so from the Masakane Hub, part of what we are looking at is we do have models, and the idea is for these models to result in use cases that can actually impact on human lives. But we need to understand what are the capabilities of these models, and in terms of those African languages that we care about. And so for that reason, we are currently working on a benchmark for African languages. And the idea is, if you take a typical model to a farmer in a rural community, what will be the performance? So that would test the performance of a model in, say, agriculture, and specifically maybe on a crop disease in a language that the LLM might support or not support. So that would give us an understanding of how good are they, and that would help inform what is the needed intervention in order to get there. I think the ultimate aim for having AI is to impact lives. And in order to impact life, it means it has to work for the people that the last mile users. So in order to understand how useful AI is for them, the current one, and what are then the gaps that need to be filled in order for it to be useful to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Dhanaraj, I know you've also been thinking about what are other effective mechanisms to improve accountability, improve trust and safety. Some of that has been, I think all the panelists have talked about participation as well. What are other mechanisms that we can, what are other sort of recommendations to boost that sort of accountability and trust and safety?
I think part of, I might answer the question in a different way. I think part of the issue around trust in AI is just public awareness and critical understanding of the benefits and risks around these models. So I think, again, most of the people on this panel, I mean, all of us on this panel, many people in the audience, could have substantive discussions around benefits and risks around different kinds of models. I think the larger narrative of the public's understanding around this is quite different. That narrative is often driven by industry that will promote these models, and I think in particular of the American frontier model companies will promote these tools as general purpose tools that are literally magical in some sense and can be applied to many different things. I think part of the challenge to improve trust and accountability around these tools, particularly for us who are working in this space, those of us, civil society, academia, media, and other kinds of experts, is to counter that narrative and to come up with a more balanced accounting of what are the limitations and risks and the benefits of these models and the specific kinds of use cases. That is not easy, but it's almost like a communication problem, to be honest. And that might be something we should think about more.
Yeah, and Arushi, as you've been doing this benchmarking work, I'm sure you had to do a lot of this sort of level setting, vocabulary familiarizing, context setting work before you sort of ask, hey, are these prompts useful? Are these answers useful to you? How did you sort of go about doing that in your studies? How are you bringing people into the conversation? And, as you're putting on the mic, I think one thing I'm always sort of struck by in these AI conversations is who is allowed to call themselves an AI expert, whose expertise is valued in these conversations. So, in expanding that table, what does it look like? What are the steps we need to do?
I think, yeah? Okay, super. Thanks for that question, Alia. I think I would just like to echo all the points that were shared earlier in terms of centering trust and accountability and having also very clear communications with the wider public at large. Coming specifically to the benchmarking piece, so maybe I'll first start by talking about the motivations of why we need to do this kind of contextual benchmarking. So we do see a lot of involvement of communities in curating data sets. It's a fantastic step that is happening in many global south countries. There are many social impact organizations, civil society organizations that are going door to door to collect recipes that have never been codified, organizations who are working with LGBTQ plus communities to understand the kind of hate slurs they encounter on social media, right? All of that is being collected, codified, and used to train LLMs. At the same time, what our argument is that we need to start involving communities in the evaluation piece as well, right? And this is where community-centered red teaming, community-centered benchmarking really comes into play. And as part of that benchmarking work, there are several steps to consider. First is how you really curating the room, right? Who is it that is annotating? What kind of values do they hold? So for example, specifically speaking about evaluating gender bias in large language models, one of the major pieces that came up was that there are certain forms of gender bias that are very objective. Everybody in the room is going to agree on it, which is perhaps the wage gap between men and women. But if we move to more subtle, more subjective forms of gender bias that also perhaps lie at the center of debate between liberal and conservative spheres, right, in terms of women's attire, in terms of women's freedom of mobility, especially how we see a lot of the conservative norms in India dictate those kind of dimensions, there was very little agreement amongst the annotators on that. So for example, the sentence that we displayed was, are men better at child rearing than women, right? And there were both pros and cons and agreements and disagreements, right? Then how do you start thinking about inter-annotator agreement when you start doing community-centered benchmarks? And this is grunt work. This is work that we need to start doing, start theorizing, as well as using these to then distill lessons. Because a lot of the other geographies are grappling with similar concerns, right? Whether it is in terms of gender bias or whether it is even in terms of what counts as harm. So what we're also doing as a next step is we're building a civil society network of Global South organizations who are going to do the safety eval work. And one of the main focus areas is to come up with shared methodologies. So, yeah, so sorry, I don't know if I answered your question directly, but I think in terms, if I have to sort of disaggregate the work of benchmarking, it starts with understanding sampling, but sampling not in a statistical manner, but sampling in terms of which powers am I representing, who are the people am I giving voice to, as well as making sure that the process is not extractive, because of course I know there's a lot of chatter also in terms of giving back to communities, but we really need to start unpacking what form would that take, right? It can't be simply in the form of cash transfers, it has to be something sustainable. More than just giving back money, it has to be about giving them agency in the design process itself, which is why I feel the safety eval work sort of puts their perspectives and lived experiences at the center of the entire AI life cycle. Yeah, I'll stop with that.
No, that's a very helpful framing also, because it sheds light on the fact that there's a lot of knowledge sharing and coordination opportunities across researchers and socio-technical experts that are working in this field across the Global South, if not across the world. Not only in terms of just like soliciting participation and the tactics to get people into the conversation, but how to then facilitate that conversation and synthesize the conversation into a conclusive thing, which is not always, the conclusive consensus is also not always attainable, you know, and then what do we do with that? Like, how do we represent that? And there's some, I think, work done, being done at Stanford on that, sort of like how to measure and document inter-annotator disagreement and how to offer different sort of jury-style applications where there is no like sort of conclusion. One person to shout out here is also like Roya Pakzad, who is at founded Taraz Research, and just previously was a Mozilla fellow, looking at the nuance you're talking about. She studies sort of how LLMs are being used as judges, as arbiters of model performance, and how LLMs are often extremely sure of themselves when they sort of test a model's capabilities. They're like, yes, this works on this, or no, it doesn't work on this, where actually the answers in more community-led processes are like, it depends, and this is what the people said in this context. So how do we sort of facilitate automation, but towards an end that are more human? This has been a fascinating panel. We have a minute, and maybe I'll stretch like the other panel did before us. Are there questions in the room? Yes, we're going to take one question from that hand over there. Yes, you, yeah.
You have limited time. Next session is ready.
Oh, okay.
Please.
We'll hear the question and then we'll...
Thank you so much. First, thank you so much for holding this space. It was quite a rich conversation across the majority world. My name is Lavansh. I'm a researcher based at Cambridge University, but also I wanted to talk about one thing which was a common strand across the things that you've talked about, which is there is a reductionism of language, right? Because language as is not a static thing. It continues to grow and evolve. But also this technology, when we say AI, we mean nothing but these, codification of algorithms is a classificatory process. So is it even of aspirational value to codify language? And should we be, no matter what we call it, indigenous AI, localization, community engagement, many things that you talked about, the technology is classificatory at the end of the day. So this colonial technology will sort of, flatten our lived experience of language and culture as is. So how do we reconcile with the technology and come to a negotiating table is my question. And I'd love to hear cross-contextually on this. Thank you.
I would also love to hear across the panel. We are not going to be able to do that because we're being kicked out. But I just want to say, please stick around, and I would love everyone to have this conversation offline. But I think what you are it's a perfect note to end on about sort of not only who has the say in developing the capabilities, but also then who has the right of refusal, right? And I think that's also part of this process. What do evaluations, but also what do participation at every stage of the life cycle, including both conception of the use of a model and then decision to use or not use a model, look like? Definitely want to have this conversation. I want to first give a huge round of applause to our incredible panelists. Thank you for your time and thank you for the work you do in this field. Hopefully this is just a conversation starter for the rest of the summit for everyone who is in this room and everyone's tuning in online. And thank you so much. Oh, we have to do another photo? Oh, okay.